Good morning, folks. We're going to be going through this presentation quickly about American Romanticism. And, I told you guys we weren't going to spend very long on rationalism because it's not super interesting. In my opinion, Romanticism is really where things do start getting interesting in American literature. Obviously, I think The Crucible is really interesting, but also wasn't actually written during the Puritan era. Stuff that was written during the Puritan era was more like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and Bradstreet's poetry. So probably not as interesting as some of the stuff that we're going to see in American Romanticism. So this is starting around the early 1800s to 1865. So we're getting a little bit more modern. This is stuff that you probably will have at least heard of, if not read before. Stuff starts getting a little bit more familiar. Oh, I guess I should do this. Ralph Waldo Emerson, we'll talk about him more a little bit later on. But he has this famous quote from the Romantic era: "We will walk with our own feet, we will work with our own hands, we will speak with our own minds." I don't know why there's not a period at the end of that, but I'll fix it. I think it's pretty clear from this that it's very individualistic, and that's going to be one of the main characteristics that we're going to see from the Romantic era. So before we look at what Romanticism is, we have to think about what it's not. Despite the name of a literary period, the Romantic era, Romanticism does not deal with sappy love stories. This, keeper of the heart, that's not the kind of literature that we're going to study. Certainly not. If you've ever heard the term to romanticize something, it doesn't mean necessarily to think about it in a romantic way. It means to kind of glorify the idea. I'm trying to think of an example of what we could romanticize. Sorry. I was looking up the definition. To deal with or describe in an idealized or unrealistic fashion, to make something seem better or more appealing than it really is. That's what romanticizing means. And I think that is a lot more, it's a lot closer to the definition that we're looking for when we talk about romanticism. So what is Romanticism? It's the name for the literary period that followed the Age of Reason in America, the rationalism, the revolutionary period. Due to the fact that the country is now established, writers move their focus away from political matters. A lot of, obviously, what we've looked at with rationalism, it's all kind of political. Abigail Adams' letter to the president, aka her husband, Ben Franklin's Project for Moral Perfection. They're moving their focus away from that and from revolutionary government ideas and start to focus on other aspects of life, like emotion and possibilities and imagination. So let's look at some characteristics of American Romanticism. Obviously, we know that in the Age of Reason, they focused a lot on rationality and reason. In the Age of Romanticism, they tend to value feeling and intuition over reason. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Excuse me. They place faith in inner experience and the power of the imagination, what you can create in your own mind, which, the Age of Reason sort of did too. It placed emphasis on people's own mind, but whereas the Age of Reason focused more on the logic of the mind, when we move on to Romanticism, we have more focus on what the mind is capable of. It shuns the artificiality of civilization and seeks unspoiled nature. Basically, like, people are fake, let's go hike in the woods or something. It prefers youthful innocence to educated sophistication. Not that they shun education, they don't, but just that they kind of romanticize the idea of youth and innocence. It champions individual freedom and the worth of the individual, like I mentioned when we looked at the quote. There's a huge emphasis placed on individualism during the Romantic era. It contemplates nature's beauty as a path to spiritual and moral development. Like if you spend enough time in nature contemplating the world, then that can help you develop your spirit and try to strive for moral, maybe not perfection, but improvement. It looks backward to the wisdom of the past and distrusts progress. That's definitely a thing that we will see opposites of later on in this class, but like they're basically saying, let's look to what everyone has learned before. Change is scary and not really good. And then it finds beauty and truth in exotic locales. That's what that means. It's just missing an E. The supernatural realm and the inner world of the imagination. So I think from this stuff, from the characteristics that we've seen, you can probably determine that it's going to be, the literature that we look at is going to be a bit more creative than what we've seen before. So this is actually a sample of American Romantic art, because all of these eras that we're looking at, they don't just affect literature, they affect art and music as well. Note the wild landscape. There's no hint of civilization. There's ominous clouds. Like we just read in the characteristics, we look more to nature and sort of distrust civilization and people. So there are types of literature that at this point we've never seen before. We have seen poetry and essays in the past eras, but this is really where short stories and novels are first published in America. So some elements are like things that we're going to see in Romantic literature. The frontier. Obviously, this is a time of exploration in America. And one thing about the frontier is that it sort of represents freedom. Like as our country expands, our possibilities expand. And sometimes that can be kind of scary because it's the unknown. But there's just this vast expanse that has no limitations on it. You'll see some optimism greater than you would see in Europe in English literature at this time because of the presence of the frontier and these possibilities. There's a lot of experimentation in science, in institutions, education. For the first time, we're seeing more of a mingling of races. There are immigrants in large numbers that start arriving to the US, and that definitely impacts our literature. And there's a growth of industrialization. There's definitely a polarization of the North and South because obviously like we're getting on to Civil War times here. In fact, what year did the Civil War start? I bet y'all know that before I do. Some of you probably know it off the top of your head. Civil War, 1861. So the very tail end of Romanticism is the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. I feel like it's one of those dates I should just know, but I don't. Maybe if I were a social studies teacher. But obviously, with that being at the tail end of Romanticism, everything that comes before it is going to show a lot of polarization between the North and the South. The North becomes more industrialized, more businesses, more factories, while the South remains agricultural, aka lots of farms. Some of the subject matter that we're going to look at, the quest for beauty. I don't like the way this is phrased. Overall, I really like this presentation. It's got everything that I would have put in a presentation, but I've noticed a few typos. There is a quest for beauty. People are trying to find beauty in nature, in art, in music, and nothing tells people how to live their lives, which obviously we know is very different from Puritanism, but also from rationalism. If we look at Ben Franklin's Project for Moral Perfection, he's got literally a list of how to live your life and an improvement plan for if you're not living that way. Romanticism doesn't put those kinds of limits on people. People can live how they want and do what they want. There's also a certain form or a certain amount of escapism, which if you guys are unfamiliar with what escapism is, I feel like we use it all the time these days. Whoops, sorry about that. What? Sorry, I'm turning my phone off. Escapism is anything that you use to escape the normalcy of everyday life. And these days, we do that through Netflix, we do that through video games, we do that through like literature that's, you know, I wouldn't say like super high quality literature, but like YA books are such escapism, generally speaking. Harry Potter's escapism. You know, you just kind of put yourself into another world for a time being and kind of escape your normal life. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that as long as you don't like completely separate yourself from the real world. There's definitely an interest in external nature for itself, for beauty. Nature could be a source for the knowledge of the primitive. We're trying to learn from nature. It could be refuge, like used sort of as escapism, escape from your normal life. Or it could be a revelation of God to the individual. People spend time in nature to sort of try to connect with God. So some techniques that they use in American literature: remoteness of settings in time and space. Probably not so much, not space like outer space, but location. Like I said, there's going to be some stuff about like the frontier and the wilderness. Some improbable plots. I'm trying to think if we're going to look at this one story that's pretty improbable. Actually, the first one we're going to look at is sort of improbable. Inadequate or unlikely characterization, people who seem really strange. A harmful morality, if we're speaking socially, like people are not concerned with being morally upright. We live in a world of lies. Ooh, that's really applicable to the first story we're going to read. An organic principle in writing: form rises out of content. It's like we're not focused so much on the rules of writing. Like, let's just try to get down the content that we want because that's what's important, and then we'll figure out the form. So some writers that are representative of this time: William Cullen Bryant, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Dark romantics, and we'll actually talk about Gothic literature. I have another presentation for another day that kind of sums up what Gothic literature is and what we're looking for in Gothic literature. But some of these people would also be considered Gothic writers. Nathaniel Hawthorne, you guys might be familiar with him from the book The Scarlet Letter. We're not going to read that because it's not incredibly interesting. But the first story that we're going to read is by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and it's one of my favorite short stories, even though it's super weird. Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe. We all know that guy. So the sort of big picture of Romanticism, their view of man, is that there's a huge focus on the individual and his inner world, what's going on in his brain, his imagination, and emotions. The romantic view of nature is that nature is beautiful and mysterious and oftentimes symbolic. God can be seen in nature. You could go out in nature and try to connect with God. And by symbolic, it kind of does depend on like the landscape that you're in. But like I mentioned, there's a lot of literature during this time period that's set in the frontier, which could represent or be symbolic of possibilities and new things. Wilderness could be symbolic for like the unknown and even possible danger. Just depends on the landscape. And also, like, don't forget that thing about the woods, because that still holds true, how like the woods can be representative for things can occur in the woods that could not occur in civilization, and oftentimes that's where people go to do dark deeds. The Romantic Guide to Truth.
It's 7 o'clock.
Thank you. Says that intuition, which is your inner voice or gut feeling, and imagination guides each individual to understanding. So you should follow your intuition and imagination as opposed to your reason from the age of rationalism or what the Bible says you should do in Puritanism. So dark romanticism, this is kind of what I mentioned before, or American Gothic literature. Some people here to take note of: Edgar Allan Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville. They're sort of known as anti-transcendentalists, and we'll talk later about what transcendentalism is. There's stuff about transcendentalism at the end of this presentation, but I'm going to cut it off because I don't want to focus too much on that just yet. They explore conflicts between good and evil, the psychological effects of guilt and sin, telltale heart, anybody, and madness. There they are. So we're going to stop here for now. Transcendentalism is a part of Romantic literature, but it's kind of got its own set of stuff. So in class, we're going to focus on regular Romantic literature first, even kind of going into Gothic literature because there's so much overlap there, and Gothic literature is also an example of Romantic literature. And then we'll move on to Transcendentalism, because while it is Romantic, it's got its own set of criteria, and it's going to be pretty different from like Melville or Hawthorne or Poe. So that's where we're going to stop for today. Thank you for your attention. Hope you enjoyed this. Sorry, my voice is kind of scratchy. I just woke up.